Hello and welcome to the Shift Book Club. I'm journalist and creator of the Shift, Sam Baker. I'm really delighted to be here with Margaret Meyer, author of this month's book club pick, The Witching Tide. It is a lovely cover. Margaret was born in Canada, grew up in New Zealand, and now lives in Norwich. She worked in publishing before retraining as a mental health therapist. And in 2020, I need to ask you if this is the lockdown thing. She completed an MA in creative writing at the much lauded University of East Anglia. And The Witching Tide is her debut novel. What can I say about The Witching Tide except it is quite something, and I have the voices are still echoing in my head since I finished reading it. It's been described as a Me Too novel for 1645. It's set during England's deadliest witch hunt and tells the story of Martha, a midwife who cannot speak or is not heard to speak, a community that turns on itself, torn apart by suspicion and fear. Welcome, Margaret. It's lovely to meet you, having read your book.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So should we start with a very basic question? Let's start with what first sparked the idea for The Witching Tide?
So what sparked the idea was a visit to Aldborough in the summer of, I think it was 2016 or possibly 2017. I'd been to Aldborough lots of times before and always loved it and always been fascinated by the Moot Hall, which is a really iconic Tudor building right in the middle of the town. And this particular day, it was a beautiful summer's day. The Moot Hall was open, which it hadn't been. It had been closed for some years while they were refurbishing. And so my husband and I paid our £2 and in we went. And at that time they had an exhibition up, just a couple of information panels about the East Anglian witch hunt and about the fact that the witch hunter, and there were two witch hunters, John Stern and Matthew Hopkins. And this particular witch hunter, Matthew Hopkins, had paid several visits to Aldborough as part of his witch hunting career. And his final visit was in the winter of 1645-6. And he rode into town at the beginning of the week and he left towards the end of the week. And as a result of his visit, 7 women were on the gallows. So I found this very upsetting. I was very moved by it, and also very struck by the fact that a lot of people involved in that episode were named. So the witch hunter was named, his female assistant was named, but not the victims. And initially this made me very, very angry. And later on I discovered they're not named because they only 2 of them were named in the record of the trial. But the other 5 women, their names were never recorded. And I think that affected me the most strongly at all. I was just so saddened by the fact that not only had women lost their lives, but they'd lost their names as well. And to lose your name means to be kind of obliterated from history. So that actually really was the spur. I just felt very emotional about it, really surprisingly so, and very determined to do something, make some contribution to writing these women's stories back into history. The other thing that came out of that visit was I hadn't realized that the witch hunters used female assistants. And these women were called search women or sometimes just prickers. And their job was to carry out very, very intimate body searches of accused women. And they really were intimate, you know, from the crown of your head right down to between your toes and everything, absolutely everything in between. And they were looking for devil's marks or witches' marks, which could be any suspect, bit of skin, a freckle, a mole, a skin tag, a birthmark. And if they found one, they would prick it hence the name, with lancets and needles and bodkins. And they thought that if it didn't bleed, this was very, very suspicious indeed. And it meant either you'd been marked by the devil, or I don't know, if you had a little skin tag or something, this might be construed as a teat where you'd suckled an imp, a devil's imp. And this would be used in evidence against you at the trial eventually. So I hadn't understood this until that fateful visit, and that was very striking to me as well. And then the sort of what if, all the possibilities of what if started playing out in my mind, and that's really when this character Martha came to mind. You know, what if you were a midwife, because the search women generally were midwives. They wanted women with experience of female anatomy. You know, what if you were a village midwife, just living your life and minding your own business in this very quiet town, and all of a sudden this witch hunt explodes and you find yourself drafted in kind of on the wrong side of it, and find yourself having to search women, your neighbors, your friends, or maybe even members of your family, people you might have known for a very, very long time. What about that? And that was when I knew I had the kind of nucleus of the story.
Wow, I've got so many questions and I hardly know where to go first from there. But since you mentioned the search women, I mean, that was one aspect that I found so fascinating, because I didn't know anything about them either. And I feel like, God knows, I feel like I've read a lot of books about witches, and so much of the focus is on the way that women betray each other, you know, and the way that, you know, that kind of, the only way I can be safe is to, you know, tell tales on my sister. So the whole, you know, this whole aspect of it was completely new to me. And was that specific, do you know, to the East Anglian witch trials, or was that something that stretched across the country?
I don't know, but I doubt that it would be specific to East Anglia. It's the case that very often it was women who were the accusers, and it was very often the case that women who were accused would name other women. I think partly, you know, partly because it was required of them. You know, the ordeal that they were put through, certainly in East Anglia, was partly to determine their culpability, but all the witch hunters were concerned with finding every last witch. You know, they really did want to round up every last one of them and deal with them. And it was the case that women did accuse other women. Neighbors, you know, did accuse neighbors. But I think, you know, I think sometimes spite was involved, but we have to remember that certainly in the case of the East Anglian hunt, life was terribly hard. The Civil War was raging in the background. There were shortages of food, partly because the army had requisitioned a lot of food for obvious reasons. And then there'd been crops failures and storms, and fishing fleets wrecked, and you know, a great many men were either were away fighting in the war, or they'd been killed in the war, so they went around to speak up for their womenfolk. So there were a lot of social and political conditions around the witch hunt that partly fed into it and partly made the witch hunt possible. And certainly in East Anglia, there was a lot of understanding that the whole social order was in total disarray. Parliament had broken down. The king was in hiding in 1645. And these are the sort of perfect circumstances for a witch hunt to gain traction. And of course, it's not so surprising then that when a misfortune occurs to you, and perhaps more than one, or a whole series of misfortunes before your community, you're going to start thinking about witches, and you're going to start looking at your neighbours in a different way. Malcolm Gaskill, who's an expert, Professor Malcolm Gaskill, who's an expert on European witch hunting, said to me earlier this year when I talked to him, he was saying that he's come to believe that in a great many cases, women acted as they did, accusing other women out of fear for the safety of their children. And I think that's, you're nodding, so am I. We can all understand that your first concern would be to protect your children from any kind of harm. And if that meant pointing the finger at the woman down the road, then you might well do it.
Well, it was all, I mean, it strikes me. I mean, I said earlier, I live in Edinburgh, where I was actually looking at the numbers earlier and I've completely forgotten them, but I think I'm just going to scroll through my notes. I mean, there were literally over a 200-year period. There were thousands, I mean, thousands of people either, tortured or hung or burnt up on, the Edinburgh Castle Esplanade, which is now covered up by the witch as well. And it just strikes me very much that the fear that pervaded the communities and kind of led to people tale telling on others, that the whole thing seemed to be like a perfect storm of fear and power, really.
Yes, and powerlessness as well, which I really is at the core of the book. And it so happens the setting is a witch hunt, but in writing it more and more, I came to feel that I was writing about women's agency and women's power, and the lengths they have to go to hang on to it, and what happens when it's removed from them or they surrender it in some way.
I mean, it struck me very much. I mean, I interviewed Maggie O'Farrell last week about the marriage portrait, and I've interviewed her about Hamnet. And it actually struck me when I was reading The Witching Tide, but even though, the books are very different and the stories are very different, what you're doing is the same thing, is that you're giving voice to people whose voices have been taken. And, in her case, the case of the marriage portrait, it's a woman who, was murdered as a teenager, and nobody knows anything about her at all. I mean, nothing. And the same with Hamlet's wife. And it struck me that I know that you feel because Francesca, who is here, has told me that you absolutely hate the phrase witchlet. I don't blame you at all. I mean, the publishing and book world does have a tendency to call anything that a woman has written something lit, because they can't just let it be a book. But it struck me as really interesting that that's what so many books are doing now. It doesn't matter whether it's about who it's about. It tends to be about giving voice to women of the past who had their voices ripped from them.
Where do you agree?
I was going to say, where do you see The Witching Tide sitting in that conversation?
In the conversation about restoring women's voices?
Giving voice to women.
I see it sitting probably fairly squarely in the middle of that. I mean, I think there's been, over the last few years, there's been a big swing by a lot of women writers to do exactly what you're saying, and not necessarily through witchlet. I think there are, lots of really wonderful books, for example, dealing with the classics, or with, the mythological stories about disempowered women, your phrase, women who've had their voices ripped away from them, and rewriting that from from the woman's point of view, and very often from an overtly feminist point of view as well. So I see myself as very much a part of that. It so happens that mine's about a witch trial, but there are numerous other examples of this phenomenon, and that's also that phenomenon, that theme is I think what gives all our books relevance today, because the brutal truth is that that's still happening. Women are still being silenced, and to be silenced historically is to be erased in large measure.
Where were we globally when you started writing this book, when you had the Aldborough trip and the Sparklet?
I don't remember too much about that. I think I would have started writing around about 2017. I don't remember, and that's probably because it was we now can see it's probably the calm before the storm of Trump getting elected, the pandemic, very obviously, other events like the Sarah Everard murder, for example, which was a shocking thing in itself, and then also very shocking to me at any rate, was the way the police tried to silence and put down the vigil for Sarah. And the Me Too movement. So I think when I first, penned the first few thousand words, I don't know that any of those things were happening at that point. But they certainly were happening as I wrote on. And I started the degree at UEA in the autumn of 2018. And I started it with a different project. But by Christmas of that year, I decided I'd taken the first 5,000 words of this book, The Witching Tide, to workshop, to be, workshopped by my peer group. And the reaction to it was so intense. There was a very, heated debate about it. I decided to make this my main project through the rest of the degree. Actually, I did over 2 years. So 2019 and 2020 then were into the pandemic. And a bit like in 1645, it felt like the world had been turned on its head. And this kind of literal contagion was going right around the world. So it wasn't difficult to kind of imagine the psychological state between then, 2020 and 1645, people very much, sometimes in fear for their lives, and this kind of only semi-visible terror that was affecting communities. There are a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, because there was a moment, wasn't there? I think kind of 2015, maybe early 2016, when Me Too happened, and it started to feel, I don't know, maybe we got complacent. It started to feel like we were making progress, and then this avalanche of backlash, with, like you say, Sarah Everard and Trump and Roe versus Wade, and it's, and you started a book at a point when it was resonating, and it's kind of horrifying that it still resonates today. But now, when it came out in, earlier this year, you could have been, I know this is an exaggeration, but you could almost have been writing about now, in a way. I know that's a gross oversimplification, but, the themes and the attitudes and the, sorry, my brain flatlined then, menopause head. The themes and the attitudes and the way that social media facilitates pile-ons and, all those things. You've clearly done a huge amount of research. Where did you start with that?
I started just by reading books about English witch hunts and the East Anglian one in particular. I was initially just very hooked on the character of the witchfinder, well, the historical witchfinder, Matthew Hopkins. At the time that I started writing the book, I was working as a therapeutic counsellor, and I was also working 2 days a week in male prisons in East Anglia. And I was running shared reading groups each week with men who were in prison because they'd committed violence of one kind or another, often against women, including men who'd, murdered women, murdered partners or other women. And I was very interested in, obviously I'm interested in psychology, but I was very interested in the psychology of witch hunting, and what would have been and what is the psychology involved of someone who decides, in Matthew Hopkins' case, to appoint himself the Witchfinder General. He would travel about with this document that proclaimed him as the Witchfinder General, and it looked like an official document issued by Parliament, but in fact it wasn't. It was just a document that he paid to have drawn up by a scribe in London. But it did sort of confer a sort of air of officialdom on him and his activities. So I was initially very interested in him, and obviously the experience in the prisons, and then reading about Matthew Hopkins was, it was all kind of blending together in my mind. And then I was very interested in how communities turn on each other, the psychology involved in that. But all the time, feeling that I didn't want to make a male witch hunter the subject of the book. I definitely wanted a female protagonist. So I did do a lot of research around the history of it, around the facts of it, around the sort of social political circumstances of those time. Obviously religion was the politics of the time, so reading around that. And then when I decided that I would go down a fictionalized route, so I was going to have a character based on Matthew Hopkins, but not him. My witch hunter, Silas Makepeace, is my creation, and also a kind of made up village. So my village, Cleftwater, is an amalgam of parts of Aldborough and parts of Staithes, actually, and in Yorkshire, and then parts of different places along the Suffolk, Norfolk coast, so Dunwich, Thorpeness, Lowestoft, Yarmouth, places like that, all combined to create this village. And so I read kind of histories of these places as well. And then as the character of Martha evolved, and I realized that she was very into plants and herbs. I read histories of gardening and herbs, and I read a really wonderful book on 17th century midwifery, Jane Sharp's famous book on midwifery, which is just a wonderful book. So that, it was a very sort of general, wide reading in order to arrive at some very specific things that went into the book.
Yeah, incredibly wide. I mean, it would have been easy to get bogged down in that quantity of research.
I just found it fascinating. I really did. Sometimes, awful, reading about the horrible fates that some of the victims suffered at the hands of the witch hunters. But, for example, reading Jane Sharp's book and reading about herbs, it was an absolute pleasure to do. And of course, it meant that I could justify lots of, when finally we were allowed out of lockdown, we were allowed to drive to other places. It justified, lots of trips to the coast, which I really love. I really love the Suffolk coast, that part of the Suffolk coastline. So any excuse to go there, I'll take it. So that was wonderful too.
Let's talk about Martha, because she's such an unusual character, isn't she? I mean, I think obviously we should start with the fact that she can't speak, or hasn't spoken for so long that she no longer knows how to. What made you decide to create a protagonist who literally has no voice?
I didn't make that decision. It came with the character. And so when I came across Martha, as I do a lot of my characters, she just kind of appeared as in a kind of like a photograph in my head of a woman, in her green dress. I could see she was older, and she was, grey hair, standing in this wonderful physic garden, medicinal herb garden, looking at me. So I knew straight away, there's my protagonist. I didn't know her name to begin with. And very often what I do when I'm starting a project is just hang out with that character and free write, just to kind of get to know them. So that's what I did with Martha. And then as I got to work properly on the manuscript, a very strange thing happened when I went to write the first dialogue scene, which comes fairly early on in the book. She's trying to have a conversation with Kit, who's the master of the household she lives in. And I discovered that I just couldn't get Martha to speak. There were no sentences. And I couldn't hear her talking either. Quite often I can sort of tune in. It's a bit like, turning the dial on the radio. I can hear what they're saying. This just didn't happen with Martha. And it was a very odd experience. I thought, wow, that's weird. Never had that before. Wrote the scene as best I could, wrote on, came to the next dialogue scene. The same thing happened. It's just bizarre. This just kind of silence where Martha's speech should have been. It just kept on happening. And after a while, I thought, this character just, for whatever reason, she just doesn't want to talk. And then a while later, and when I say a while, it's like many weeks or even months going by with me trying to puzzle this out. I thought, oh, I don't think she can talk. And at that point, I just had to stop writing. I didn't know what to do. I just thought, how am I going to finish a novel with a lead character who's nonverbal? I just don't know how I'm going to do that. And that was when doing the degree at UEA was so brilliant, because, I could take this kind of technical problem, this technical challenge to workshop and work it through with my peers, who all said, the non-verbalness is intrinsic to her, don't change that. But the workaround was to write dialogue, very minimal dialogue, which was like getting blood out of a stone, I have to say, knowing that eventually it would all be cut later on. And that's what I did. That allowed me to keep going with the book. And I guess I would have been about 3/4 of the way through that first draft when it dawned on me that she would have a kind of sign language, obviously not British Sign Language as we know it today, but that's how she would have made herself understood. And that was a real breakthrough then. Partly just, for technical reasons. It was a huge relief. Okay, so I'm going to be able to finish this book. But also, then I understood the gift in it, because, of course, her silence was absolutely the core of what I was writing about. It just absolutely articulated the main theme of the book. And my main concern, as we've been saying, is the way women were silenced and still are. And how silence and speaking are so integral to personal agency. especially women, I think. And then I just got very fascinated about the ways in which different characters responded to Martha's non-verbalism. The characters close to her are invested in her, and they've, like, her immediate household and her friend Janet, they've taken the time to understand her sign language. But the further away we go from those close circle of people who love Martha and care about her, the less well understood she is, and the less effort people put in, until finally you come across her antagonists, like the witch hunter and some of the jailers, who are convinced that she's a witch and are very disrespectful of her signing. And all the things that we would recognize now, about being talked over, about being words or thoughts being attributed to us that we're, that aren't not what we're thinking or saying, being dismissed. Sometimes she's mocked. Oh, she just flaps her hands like an old crow. All of that is just intrinsic to the thing.
I mean, I love the idea that it was Martha's idea, not yours. I kind of don't, I think you should just claim it because it's so genius, and it gives such meaning and resonance all the way through to every single interaction. I mean, for instance, with oh God, is it Agnes,
her mistress?
Her mistress, yeah. I mean, the fact that she never, all you need to know is that she doesn't bother to sign, doesn't bother to learn to sign, she doesn't bother to build a relationship with this woman who's effectively her mother-in-law, but actually closer to her husband than potentially his mother would have been for a manifestation. But it really struck me. I think it's probably about 2/3 of the way through the book when she says that Master Makepeace says my silence is a sin, and it really feels like that. Damned if you do and damned if you don't. The women who are speaking are wrong. The woman who won't speak or can't speak is wrong. It's just like, in that time, and also in some times now, but in that particular time, there was no way of getting it right, because I think it's Janet says there were no covens. There were no witches here until he came.
Right.
And that's, it's like he brings it with him as his, the inspiration for him did. And it's so interesting that actually the thing that most about, or one knows most about, the East Anglian witch trials, as opposed to, say, the Pendle witch trials, which are a bit more focused on the women, is that all you really know is about Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
He has gone down in history, albeit the wrong side of history, but he's the one that everybody's heard of.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who has resonated and who has continued to be known. And it's completely fascinating. And anyway, I just think that you should claim that as your own genius rather than Martha's, because it does the work of so much, but I can imagine it was incredibly hard to pull off.
In the beginning it was. It got easier as we went along. And I have to say, Francesca Main, who's here with us tonight, my brilliant editor, she was so helpful in making suggestions that would clarify all that signing and how Martha is perceived. It took effort. It's effortful.
Yes, I'm sure. It's just as an aside, really, I read the book a while ago, and then very recently I listened to the audiobook. And it was only when I started listening to the audiobook, I thought, well, how is this going to work? Because she doesn't speak. And it was very interesting. And in fact, the Miranda Raisin who reads it does do a very good job.
She does.
But still, it has to be kind of translated into a sort of whisper.
That was an interesting, that was another technical challenge And I remember after the book, Francesca had signed the book, and I went to London to meet the wonderful Phoenix team, and I met some of the sound engineers who were going to produce the audiobook, and I was absolutely flabbergasted that there was going to be an audiobook. For the reason you've just said. And I remember saying to them, but how will you do Martha? And they sort of, there was a bit of a pause, and they said, we'll think of something. And then when it was being recorded, we then had to think very hard about how to render Martha's non-verbalness. And it needed to be a simple solution, you know, obviously. And so the two ideas we had were to slow her speech right down, so it has a slightly halting quality to it. But you know, the point of that was that Miranda would speak Martha's lines kind of at the speed at which they would have been signed, and then the sort of half volume to convey the point about the difficulty in making herself being heard and understood.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really front of mind when you're writing a book, but it is that's a really interesting dilemma. Martha is such an original and powerful character. I mean, kind of as evidenced by the way that she walked into your mind and refused to speak to you. How did you stop her pushing all the other characters off the page?
You know, she's quite retiring. She's used to being a figure in the background. You know, she's a servant. She's been, so she works for Kit Crozier, who's become a very wealthy merchant, and she's known him pretty much all his life. So there was never any issue about her pushing everybody off the page. In fact, probably the opposite. There were points at which she kind of disappeared. And some of the feedback I got from various people was, you know, where's she gone? She's in the scene, but she seems to be kind of invisible. So actually I had the opposite challenge, which was keeping her visible and not letting her kind of fade into the background, which intrinsically is something that she would want to do. It sounds a bit woo-woo to say, you know, I kind of channel characters, but I kind of do. I think of them as out there in the ether, fully formed, and I just sort of stumble on them. And as I said earlier, it's only by hanging out with them that I get to understand them. So I'm sort of very fortunate in that respect that I got to tell Martha's story. So it was a bit like being an amanuensis or something to her. As I say, the challenging parts are when she was very faint. I remember particularly there's a scene quite early on when she's been told she's going to be a search woman, and she has to go with the witch hunter to a big gathering of the sort of town elders, who are all men, to decide, you know, what to do about the accused witches. And I had to rewrite that scene many times to keep Martha kind of in it, because she just sort of kept trying to fade into the background.
Really interesting. You said earlier that you took the first 5,000 words in to be workshopped. Can you tell us what those first 5,000 words were? I mean, which bit of the book was it? And do forgive me, I've realised that I'm vanishing into darkness. I'm just going to go and pop a light on while you...
Sure.
Sorry. There we go.
Oh, there you are. So those first 5,000 words they're made it in. They're originally, I opened the book with the scene where Martha is hanging out to dry the stained sheet that she's used to deliver the baby, Janet's sister's baby, the night before. So they're now not the opening pages, but they're not far. They're not far away from the beginning. Yeah.
Do you do a lot of plotting and structuring, or are you what's known in the trade as a pantser?
I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I do like to try and plot and structure. I certainly did doing the MA because of the pressure to keep producing words. I just couldn't pants it. You couldn't just turn up and wrestle with a blank page. I needed to know what I was going to write that day as far as possible. So I kind of do a lot of what I call macro plotting. So I have the big picture of the overall narrative arc, and I do try then to sort of delve into that and break it down into smaller chunks, scene by scene or major plot point by major plot point. And that all works fine. And then I generally find there comes a certain point where I can't get the detail in the abstract. It only comes from actually starting to write. That's when all the sort of colouring in, I suppose, comes along. So, yeah, a bit of both, probably.
Do you work with the equivalent of a mood board? So you're kind of surrounded by inspiration?
No. Although having said that, and I keep looking up at the wall, I've got a picture of, it's a early 20th century picture of Staith's. It's a photograph that I've had framed. It's on the wall over my computer here. And I've got another picture on the mantelpiece behind me of Aldborough. They would be probably the closest things I would have to, visual prompts. There was a point where probably about the middle of the manuscript where I had printed out, I had to have the cast list of characters printed out and blue tacked to the wall, and the names of various streets in the village printed out and blue tacked to the wall just to remind me. It's quite obvious now, but at the time it was quite a lot to entire village to carry around in my head, and the citizens of the village and where they all lived and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So did you kind of map the village out in your head because it's a fictional village?
Yes, I did. I had quite a clear picture in my mind of where things were, and which was great because just before the book was published in July, the team at Phoenix decided they would produce a kind of brochure to go with the hardback that has a map of Cleftwater in it. It was a bit, I think it was fairly close to publication. So I remember one night just sitting down and just drawing this very, very inept map to send off to the designer. But it was all there, Yeah, it was all there.
One of the things that we haven't talked about yet that I really want to talk about is the poppet. So tell me about that, because it's so integral, isn't it, the poppet, to every story about witches you ever heard or read?
So that was not there from the beginning. I can't remember. I can remember where I was when I suddenly realized that there was going to be a poppet. I was in the university library up at UEA. It was a bit of a thunderbolt, and a bit like any other character, I had to I tried to hang out with the poppet, and I interviewed it, and then I did free writing from the point of view of the poppet, and I think I wrote a sentence that said, "I am the puppet," and then it just all ground to a halt.
Yeah.
And it's very enigmatic. It really is, even to me, even now. And I think in earlier drafts of the book, it wasn't properly realized. And again, the brilliant Francesca and my US editor, Cara Watson, they were both fantastic at, urging me to kind of draw out aspects of the puppet. And actually, in the end, what became the most important thing was not the puppet itself. And to me, and this is where my sort of rational psychologist's head switches on, it is just a piece of sculpted wax. But what's interesting is the beliefs that people transfer onto it or take from it. It's an icon like any other icon, like a crucifix or a pentagram or an anything else. And I think that's kind of an important point for me, because the book is about a world in which some symbols were absolutely condoned, like the Christian cross, for example, and others absolutely weren't, like puppets. And so there we have this, tremendous duality about symbols and who has what symbol, and when are they allowed and when are they not allowed. And if it's a puppet, that's a bad thing. And if it's a puppet in the possession of a woman, that's even worse. And then you have this sort of, well, is she a witch because she's got a puppet? Or, does the puppet make her a witch? Or is she just understood to be a witch because she owns a puppet? And, this, as you've said, this is addressed in other books about people accused of witchcraft as well. But it just became very central. Well, I wanted it to become more central in mine, mainly as a way of unpacking the kind of double standards and the double standard in the values attaching to women and symbolism, and all the often negativity that's attached to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a significant symbol, isn't it? It's interesting to think of it, like you say, as just a lump of wax.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did an event a couple of weeks ago here at North Norfolk, and there was a gentleman in the audience who came up afterwards and said that he grew up in, I think he said Sheringham, and this was before the NHS came into being. And so anyone in the village who became unwell went to see one of two wise women who were, older women, herbalists, very skilled in that kind of medicine. And he said they both had wax puppets that they had inherited from their mothers, who had the puppets from their mothers, and on through the generations. So these were like the real deal Marthas of his village, and real puppets that were handed on from woman to woman, down through the generations. I think, that the hair on the back of my neck certainly went up. I thought that's exactly what I'm writing about. And, when he talked about it, it sounded actually kind of benign and kind of a kind of wonderful thing, that this piece of wax was regarded almost as an heirloom, just like any other heirloom, like, I don't know, baby teeth or a lock of someone's hair or a ring or whatever. Which, of course, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be, but until a witch hunt breaks out, and then a puppet's a total liability.
Just handed down, like maybe some, recipes for herbal cures or
Right.
anything. And it's, One of the things that really interests me was that ultimately, I mean, we touched on fear earlier and the women's fear, but actually, one of the things I keep coming back to is that it just feels to me, and because I am a bit obsessed with the way women in midlife are treated and how they change and how their attitudes change, but it does seem to me very much that this is about fear of people, stroke men in society, of something that they can't control, that they can no longer see the point of because they're no longer fertile, they're no longer, attractive according to, the male gaze. And and that they have a knowledge that they don't have. So whether it's, with the ability to birth children or heal, or it strikes me as so much about their fear as well as about the fear of women. And I really, you can't help but notice that we still use the language of witch, witch, hag, crone to denigrate women. It's still wielded like a weapon
Right.
in society, probably right now. I mean, certainly Trump was always flinging it at people, Jeremy Clarkson was saying about wanting to parade Meghan through the streets,
Yes.
It's so prevalent, and particularly the words around which, similar words like hag and crone, which are always applied to older women. Why do you think we haven't moved on?
I don't know, but
Yeah, no,
I
me
think,
neither.
but I suspect it's very much connected into men's fear, just as you were saying, that, and it possibly, now in our era, although we live in very troubling times, as someone, a younger woman was saying at one of the events recently, she said, I don't know how many waves of feminism there have been, but it's been a few. And we're still grappling with the same sort of problems. And, nobody's happy about that. But older women today are less and less likely to be invisibilized. We're not going to be quiet. We're not going to just slope off into the kitchen and make tea for all the younger folk, especially younger men, the way our predecessors did. As you say, we know a bunch of stuff. And some of that knowing is exclusive to women, like childbirth, for example. And I think they're still worried by us. I think they're still afraid. And I think it's not a very big jump then to make from that kind of woman to witch, because the witch has always been an affront to patriarchy. I personally think that's a big part of her potency, that she's in society, she functions in society like a Martha type person. She can live in the middle of a community and be a healer and help people and grow plants that help them and run households and so on. And yet the moment that type of woman is branded a witch, she's put on the periphery of a society, but she still has influence over it. It may be construed as a malign influence, but she still has influence. And it's hard to take that away, which is why these women have to be put to death so often, I think.
Yeah.
The witches are there to remind us that patriarchy is, it's not the whole story, and it never will be.
Yeah, and I do think as well, that's why we're seeing such a big pushback at the moment.
I agree.
Kind of. There's a question from Joe, who it's a very good point actually, that having created such a groundbreaking non-speaking protagonist, how are you going to follow that?
So I'm
Asking for your
following
editor.
So the follow-up is doesn't feature Martha, but it is set in Cleftwater still, and it's about other women who come across the poppet in different centuries. So I'm toiling away, trying to get words on paper at the moment, but it's three, possibly even four women into whose lives the poppet comes. And the poppets are kind of, as various people have said to me in recent weeks, it's a kind of disruptor.
Yeah.
It disrupts in different ways. So this book is about these stories of other women who find the poppet, and curious disruptive things happen in their lives because of it. It's all set in Cleftwater, but in different centuries. So tons of historical
I love the sound of
that one.
Yeah. God. Oh, I love the sound of that. Jo loves the sound of it too.
Great.
I'm just going to ask you a couple of booky questions, just because it's always nice to pick the brains of a writer. So, which writers do you admire?
Oh, lots.
How long have you got?
Yeah. Hilary Mantel, as just devastated. I'd always cherished this hope that one day I might meet her. Yeah, but her work, I think I have most of her books. I'm just looking over there at my bookshelf. Toni Morrison.
What's your favourite of hers? Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I love Flood, and I love Beyond Black. And I'm also very, very fond of, well, I love the Wolf Hall books as well, but A Place of Greater Safety, which is about the French Revolution. I don't know how many times I've read that book. I go back and back to it just for the sheer marvelousness of her writing. And likewise with Toni Morrison. I don't know where to start with. All her books are incredible, but I really love Sula particularly. I love Washington Black by Essie Bedugian. John McGregor's work. Coonan Jones, who's a Welsh writer. I've just come through a Damon Galgut phase. I've now read all his books as well. I love his prose. And I'm reading This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangaremba, an incredible book. I mean, I could go Janet Frame, another New Zealander.
Yeah.
An astonishing writer. Yeah.
Okay, last question, and it feels appropriate to ask you this since you admire Hilary Mantel. Does she, when she used to interview people on stage, she would always finish with this one question, which ever since I found this out, I've started stealing it because I love it. Which writer or book gave you courage?
Oh, that is a wonderful question. Gave me courage. I'm going to say a book that recently gave me courage was Claire Keegan's book. This is me having a senior moment. The one that was shortlisted for the Booker.
Yeah, is it Small Thing?
Small
Things Like These.
Yes, Small Things Like These. Yeah. It gave me courage as a writer to be reminded of the fact that you don't need to have compendious books to have such incredible resonance and depth. And also the story it tells. I mean, it's a small personal act of courage with enormous ramifications. And that's a wonderful thing to be reminded of, because I think that's, well, I know that's how change occurs. 16 years working as a mental health therapist, people change by taking small acts of, small personal acts of courage, one after another, is how they affect change in their own lives. And I think that's probably true on a wider scale as well. So I think small things like these, gave me a lot of, lit something in me, which was wonderful.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for being so fascinating. As I said to you earlier before we started, this will go up on YouTube tomorrow for all the people who couldn't come. So I'm afraid it will be there for posterity. So thank you for joining us, and get on with that book because we all want to read it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on. It's just been wonderful to talk to you.
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Good luck. Good night, everybody.
Bye for now.